Good? Okay. Hi, everyone. I know I am between you and the party, so I'm going to try to be very entertaining. My name is Laura Wright. I am a solutions architect from the Identity Solutions team, and I'm here to talk to you about how to simplify data lake access with IAM Identity Center and trusted identity propagation. Now, you are probably very familiar on how this looks in AWS, right? You have several data sources. Maybe you have a traditional database. Maybe you're streaming in data. I don't know, maybe you have some data sets on-premise that you store in your file systems. And the first step here is really to ingest, connect and ingest with this data, right? And in AWS, we do that with Glue. Glue will connect to your external data sources. It also offers crawlers so that you can establish the catalog and extend the schema automatically, right? And then this data set is registered, discoverable, and available to the catalog. Then after that, what you want to maybe transform that data. Maybe some cleansing is necessary or augmentation before it's ready to be consumed by the end users and the applications, right? But what is really important about the talk today is not really this, because you have tools in AWS to do this, and you're probably very familiar. What is important is what happened after, right? Once that data is ready and is in a storage like S3 or Redshift, and you have an application that needs to communicate with this data and needs to give accurate answers according to the persona that is interacting with your application. So let's say an example that everybody's talking about during re:Invent, which is an AI chatbot, right? You have an AI chatbot, and we can easily power this chatbot with Athena so that the application in the background actually calls an Athena query. And then we enrich that answer with LLMs before sending it back to the front end, right? But how do we do access control here? There are two parts to this. One is you as the administrator for these services, you set them up, right? And then the second part is the end user. How does Athena know what that end user itself has access to? And in AWS, we do this with IAM roles. And you're probably familiar with IAM roles but we have challenges with that, especially from the end user perspective. Why? Because let's say you have Laura, who is a sales manager, and then you have the marketing team, and then you have the data science team. Then you need a role for every single access pattern that you have, and a policy for each of those roles. As your access patterns grow, you have a multitude of roles and policies that you need to manage. Because you're modeling that access, instead of on the user, you're modeling in IAM policies. Your policies can become complicated, right? So you easily can reach policy size limit. And with time, and when the proliferation of roles, there is a high risk potential that you might have overly permissive roles, or you have permissions that are no longer used, right? But if you think about this from the end user perspective, all of these challenges span from the fact that you don't have a global identity and a unified access control model, right? What happens when the user assumes a role? We have one role that can be assumed by many users, right? And once they are doing this assume role session, what happens is very difficult to track every single action that the user has performed. Now, we recognize this challenge, and our first step to be able to solve it is trusted identity propagation. Now, trusted identity propagation is a feature of IAM Identity Center. And what it does is allows you, as an administrator of the AWS service, to assign permissions based on the human identity, based on the end user, or the group that that end user belongs to. Now, how is that possible? Because it's a feature of Identity Center, you first need to have Identity Center itself, right? And where does the identities come from? You first have Identity Center. You integrate Identity Center with your identity provider. That could be Okta, could be Entra, could be Active Directory, whatever your company is using, right? And you bring those identities into AWS. Once that identity is inside AWS, then it becomes a single universal identity in your AWS ecosystem. That identity has a unique user ID and is recognized by all the integrated applications. And pay attention when I say integrated, right? Because applications like, we call it AWS applications, like QuickSight or Amazon Redshift or Kiro that everybody wants to go to right now to the house of Kiro, all of those applications are able to talk to Identity Center and the Identity Store and actually extract information about this user. And that information being like what identity store this user belongs to and what groups these users belong to. And this allows you as an administrator to go inside Redshift, for example, and actually create access to a schema for that user specifically or for a group that exists now in Identity Center. And when you do that, let's say you're using Redshift with Lake also understands that same user, right? So it's a unified access control model. And we are building up to this. Now, how does it actually work? If you see here this diagram, thank you, you're very responsive. If you see here this diagram, we see that we have all the AWS managed applications. And these applications first need to be registered with Identity Center. So when you enable the application, for the ones that are integrated, you will see an option to connect it with Identity Center. Once you do that, and you can do that from a member account, right? Because Identity Center is a org construct. However, it has the way that this was designed is so that it can be delegated. So you probably don't manage Identity Center, but you want to create a Redshift application, right? So as long as the Identity Center is in the org, then you are able to access that directory, okay? So, okay, let's follow the graphic. So first, you register that application with Identity Center. Then you assign access to, in this case, Alice inside Redshift. When Alice logs in and authenticates with Identity Center, then and Alex tries to access Amazon Redshift can go to Identity Center, the Identity Store, check who is Alex, and check all the groups that Alex has access to. And authorize access to the data, to the schema, to the role based on those users or maybe the groups that Alice has access to. So if we compare it before, I think the visual is really important because think about this. Here we have three different personas, right? We have Alice, that is the market, and we have a role. And this IAM role is the one that Alice is assuming to be able to access the bucket, right? But not only Alice assumes that role, right? Maybe Bob can also assume that role. At that point, when two of them are assuming that role, inside your CloudTrail logs, then you see the assumed role, but you don't see the actual actions to access the data inside Athena, right, or Redshift. Another pattern that could happen with IAM roles is that data could have access, cross-account access to many other data sets. So it's a little bit more challenging to track this. With trusted identity propagation, and don't take this as there are no roles. There are roles, but for the services, not for the end users. And that's the beauty of it, right? What you do in the application itself is no more roles. Alice will no longer assume a role. Alice would log into QuickSight or Redshift or whatever application you're using. And the application directly will give control to the data, right? So you no longer have this one-to-many relationship. Now, if we still have roles, but the end user doesn't need roles, how does this work? It's a little confusing, right? So let me just clarify that for you. This is the example that I gave in the beginning. Let's say we have QuickSight. In QuickSight, we have enhanced QuickSight to have the actual chat experience in there, right? You can power that chat experience with Athena, for example, like you have here. All the AWS services you see here, all of them still have a role. These are service roles that the AWS services use to communicate with each other, okay? And they have the minimum policies that the services need to make the call to grant access to the data. But the difference is that now we enhance that service role with the identity context of the user that logs in, okay? So we can say when Alex logs in Amazon QuickSight assume his service role and enhances it with Alex. Amazon QuickSight, Alex starts chatting with your chatbot, right? And because your chatbot is powered by Athena, then Amazon QuickSight calls Athena, right? This is through the service role. But in that call, it also contains Alex context. So Athena now knows this is made on behalf of Alex. And Athena, if it is using Lakeformation, then that's the same thing. Call Lakeformation and passes on Alex context. And that happens, that happens for every single user. So now instead of you managing 1, 2, 3 roles for your users in this case, plus all the roles for the services, you manage only the roles for the services with minimum permission. And you grant access directly to the user. And the good thing about this too is that it makes it easier to track. Because at every API call, every service API call, this is logged in CloudTrail. And the CloudTrail log looks a little bit different. Can you see the CloudTrail log over there? Yeah. So this is the CloudTrail log on an assume role. And you see this call will come from Athena, the service itself. But you have the typical user identity portion of the CloudTrail log, and you have this portion in the red square. This is the on behalf of portion and the user ID. This on behalf of portion will be in every single log. It will be in the QuickSight log, in the Athena log, in the Lakeformation, and the S3 log. So, and this user identity is unique across the AWS organization. So all of these services can actually know who this user identity is. And now, because you have this in every single log, you can query all actions that were performed by this user identity, right? Things that you couldn't do before. And I think the biggest takeaway from all of this really is this user identity. Because if you look at it, you have the user ID, which belongs to the directory, and you also have the identity store arm. So you can identify which exact identity center this comes from. Just in case if you're doing other POCs and you have more than one instance, and you can identify exactly where Alice comes from. And this, because it's unique, and it's not only unique in your organization, that ID is actually unique across all organizations. It has unique user ID, UUID for Alice. So this makes it so that you now have a centralized identity that is understood across your AWS ecosystem. It can be, it's logged, so it can be tracked, right? Which before was more challenging. And also, you can create granular user-specific permissions on the user itself that before you had to use several roles to achieve. It allows you to also not have that role, a big number of roles that you needed to have before. And now you only worry about what is important to you, which is what do you do with that data, right? One more thing that I think is important is this identity-aware pass through every single service, downstream service, because this happens right now from the entry point service. So you need to have a client-facing application, right? In this example that I gave, it was QuickSight, but it could be a custom application that you have. Let's say you have an employee portal where your employees are also checking on ticket support, right? From there, you can do the same thing. And I think that's very powerful because it's not just made for AWS services. You can integrate your application and use the same identity that comes all the way from your identity provider to AWS, to the AWS environment. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming.